Good afternoon. We are going to start the white paper session now. We are going to draw our inspiration from Tāme. He couldn't be with us this afternoon because he had to leave to be with his wife. So what we're going to do is really draw upon some of the ideas that he shared with us and he inspired us with, and generate some conversations about the concepts of what does it mean to decolonize ourselves and what does it mean to indigenize the university. So maybe as we start, we begin by discussing some of the ideas that Tāme shared with us. And one of these ideas that seem to emerge across the conversations we've had over the last week is the idea of space, and the concept that how do we build space that is decolonizing, and what is the relationship between that decolonized space and the space within the university. So in our conversations that Steve and I had with Tāme, he talked about this idea of moving that space of learning and of knowledge generation into the marae, recognizing the sovereignty of the marae as a space for knowledge generation, with the idea that decolonized knowledge itself is generated in community by people in the community and owned by them. In that sense, then, the role of the university also is transformed in terms of thinking through how the university exists within the context of the decolonization project. One of the key ideas there then becomes that the university simply just doesn't look at decolonization as another tick mark, checking out some boxes and then saying that, okay, now we have decolonized because we have fulfilled these boxes, and still retaining power within the colonial structures of the university, but rather to actually start thinking through how to deconstruct the very structures of the university to make these structures porous, and in that process actually support the knowledge generation and the learning capacities of communities within the context of their decolonial struggle. So the challenge here is powerful because it suggests that the very idea of the university needs to be decolonized, particularly thinking through the ways in which universities measure, reward, and structure processes of learning, processes of research, and processes of engagement, where the power still is very much held within the colonial structures of the university. So then I guess, what I take away from that is what does that mean for learning to belong to the marae, for the ownership of that learning process to happen in the marae, and for the university to be in a supportive role, in a capacity supporting role in that transformative journey. So maybe I will throw that question to our audience and hear some thoughts from them in terms of how do you imagine this movement, from the university being a structure that simply does outreach as a way to reach out, and that becomes decolonization, to completely transforming it to communities owning the sites and spaces of knowledge generation. Kia ora. It is my honor and privilege to host the activist of activists, Tāme Iti, as CARE's activist in residence. Tāme Iti's voice is a powerful voice of our times as we identify, examine critically, and seek to challenge racism, colonialism, xenophobia, and the intersections of these three. Iti's work with activism started with his involvement in the Maori nationalist movement in New Zealand in the late 1960s and 1970s. He protested against the Vietnam War and apartheid in South Africa, and he became involved with Ngātamatoa, a major Maori protest group of the 1970s from its early days. He joined the Communist Party of New Zealand and went to China in 1973 during the Cultural Revolution. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit with him about his engagement with China within the context of culture and cultural change. He's taken part in a number of land occupations and held a hikoi to the New Zealand Parliament. We hope to learn from these acts of activism as anchors to social change. He's worked as a radio DJ and artist. He was a partner in a restaurant in Auckland's Karangahape Road that served traditional Maori food. And hopefully from this we also learn about business, sustainability, and frameworks for sustainable imagination, particularly within the context of decolonization. He stood for Parliament as a candidate of Mana Maori in the 1996, 1999, and 2002 New Zealand general elections, and for the Maori Party in 2014. Art and creativity have been hallmarks of the protest activities that Tāme Iti has participated in. How you bring creativity into the processes of change is a lesson I hope we can learn from him through this conversation. Decolonization is a thread that has woven together his journey in seeking spaces for voices. As I have spoken with him very briefly over these last 2 days, I've been inspired by his ideas of space and making space. It is this commitment to decolonize within, to decolonize the structures we inhabit, that makes his voice a powerful and inspiring anchor to social change. Welcome to Care, Tāme.
Thank you, my friend. It's a real privilege for me to be here and part of this conversation. And also thanks to you and to Massey University for opening and creating this space for me to be able to share these thoughts. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. You talk a lot in your conversations about space. So maybe we begin from that. How does space appear in your work?
Well, it's through the ancient stories of the separation of Rangi and Papa, through the conversation with the children. And when one of the children had discovered going through the armpit and view the space, because they didn't have the space. And so out of that came out create this conversation with the 70 children, Rangi and Papa. And so we don't want to be here. So out of that came this huge debate with each other about how to create a space. And so the children say, other part of the children say, get rid of them, knock them out. And so out of that conversation, Tāne didn't say anything. Tāne was the one who decided to create this space, lied out on his back on Mum, on Papa Tuanuku, and out with his legs out there and push them out there, and they create the space. And so, and I guess that for every human being, there had to be a time when we leave home and create a space and let them go freely. So I thought that is the story, and the way that we process ourselves on the marae there. And when any people that arrive to the marae, you come to the gateway, and that is the gateway where that space has been created. So you don't go walk onto the marae and walk up there and say, "Hi, my friend, my name is George." No, you don't do that. You had to walk in there, and it's a process. So there's a conversation right from the beginning as we enter through the gate. Then a person will arrive there with a taiha, eye-to-eye contact, check you out. You've got to be ready and lay out the taki on the ground. And as soon as that, and that's the first part of the process. Let it go, get picked up. It's like the branch of peace or the branch of war. And once they pick them, that person picked the taki, the visitors, and then he go back, and then two voices appeared. And then the woman is the first voice that appeared. And they will make the call. And that first call is a conversation. And they will call out, that call will go, welcome. Welcome to my home. Welcome to my mountains. And then that voice will provide all of the data informations. Who is here, the name of the people, and then to the response to that, the other voice will say, greeting to you from here, from this party that come from the Taitokoro. So all of that create those conversations. And so allow you to walk onto the middle of the marae ātea where the space is. And also to remind you, because when those voices, when the voices are happening, the voices are going a two-way thing, not just physically, but also spiritually. They're the voice that call out the ancestor and call the voice carry on and pull the environment, the energy of the sky, bush, and everybody around there to contain it. So it's a beautiful way that we're able to open the space, and then we start those conversations. And so we need to have that type of process. So I'm a great believer in the rituals that enable us to breathe, to give us time to think about things. We give us time to think about those who are not here. So you're not just walking alone, and even if you're by yourself, but you're not by yourself, because you're carrying with you your whakapapa, your genealogy, because you are a byproduct of somebody from way back. So all of that are interesting part of meeting with each other.
How beautiful. One of the things that appears salient here in the idea of space is respecting the past. Now, it seems that...
Well, your past, when we see, because when you walk into the marae ātea, because immediately in front of you is your past. Your past not behind you. Every now and then we bump into our past. And so you walk into the past. So you bring the ideas into that. So it's that two-way sort of types of conversation. You kind of work there. So I'm not just talking to you. I'm talking to everybody who are here, but also the people not here. But I'm also talking to all those that was here. Understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when referring to that past, particularly thinking about colonization, when there has been so much violence to shut off space, how does one access that past, especially when one has been told that that past was primitive, it was not good enough, one has to upgrade to come to the present?
Well, you can't just walk into that space. So we managed to maintain and retain that, or those rituals. And, even the structure around that particular, the marae ātea, the pā, the community are very well contained. And I know that one of the first things that the colonizer, when they brought the troops into part of the area, and when they so the first thing that the colonizer had to do, they had to find, they thought that this country is beautiful. They had the trees, the fresh, they had everything here. The only problem is, I was in the way, people in the way. So they had to find a way to deal with that, and so they had to come up with policies. So the first thing that they did was they were brave enough to introduce called the 1863 Rebellious Act of Parliament that they write it down themselves to justify why they need to come and if you open your mouth, you're a rebel. And so they responded by that, and they used that as a way to get rid of you out of the space. So they actually did it. They did it in Tūhoe, the Waikato, up north, all over the country. And so they arrived there, and so they issued an eviction notices. They gave us 3 months there to move out of the space, and if you're still there in 3 months' time there, well, they just come down there. So they burned the gardens down, they burn the house down, they burn the marae there down, and they ship you miles out of the space because you cause a problem, you know. And and so our people had to work underground in a way to find a way. What is this? What is happening? You know, and and so our people did resist. They didn't just went back. Yeah, so they had to trying to find another way that they can deal with how to resist against the power of British colonial system. It wasn't just happening here in Aotearoa, it was happening in India, happening in Africa, was happening in Canada, right around the world. You know, they already done a lot of practice, a lot of training, and that's just another part of their colonial power, of the colonizers.
So one of the things, I'm thinking you brought up India, so I will refer to that, referring to my past, right? One of the things that seems salient that happened there is that you silence voices to move people out of the space.
Yes.
And it seems that that is continuing to happen today.
Yes, it still is in several many ways, but for India in the 1800s and towards the end of the 1800s, you had passive resistance of people like Te Piti Arunamai Taranaki in Parihaka, and he was the one he inspired Mahatma Gandhi, who followed the kōrero and the story of Te Piti Arunamai. And he himself took the same action on passive resistance. So people like the Piti Arunamai, and then of course Ruakenana, and then of course come to our generation, and we still carry the raising of the flags and still trying to find a way that we can, our voice needs to be heard. So they tried in Parliament, they tried with the 4 Māori seats with Ngata, Carroll, Buck, and Pōmari, you know, and so they tried with those guys, but they were the forefronts of the of tribal people to take policy of colonial mentality to those communities.
Can we give the microphone to our audience, please?
Picking up on your point about the audience size, I thought it was quite fascinating that someone could come in without any university qualifications or education and just be able to engage in a university setting with that amount of people, just like a lecturer at the front of the hall, and do it in a way which is kind of, you know, like what we used to really in a university environment, with an excellent lecturer or professor at the front without qualifications though. And I'm wondering whether that means there's space to reimagine what the university could actually look like. You know, because that's unheard of, having someone like that without a PhD or master's standing there and actually delivering something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a beautiful idea, and that's where I would like to go with Tāme's notion of the marae being a space of knowledge generation. Certainly we have seen that in a lot of the work of care, where communities are the owners of knowledge. So say women farmers who own indigenous knowledge of the seeds, like growing millets and sustainable farming, and actually become the sources of wisdom, become the teachers that we could go to learn from. Now, this concept is also really interesting because it has to work in a way that challenges, again, the role of university as an extractive institution. And I think that is part of the decolonization process, is to reimagine the nature of university as it exists now. Because in a lot of the way in which we go about the business of engagement is we go to communities, we script the knowledge that is produced in the communities, we gather it, and then we privatize it, commoditize it, and circulate it in networks of capital to benefit the university and to benefit us as participants in the political economy of the university. So what you're suggesting, Steve, is really decolonization in terms of fundamentally asking about what it means to produce knowledge. So that the decolonization process is not about, helping me build my CV further, so that now I am an expert on how to decolonize, so that, like Tāme was saying, so that children from the Marae can come to the university now to learn to decolonize, but rather to disrupt the very idea of university with the idea that knowledge actually exists in the Marae in terms of the processes of decolonization and the habits of decolonization, and perhaps we need to learn from there. Now, having said that, I think it's the practical modality of that is the key here, because colonization as a habit, it works to co-opt. It has this incredible capacity to co-opt and to incorporate decolonizing voices within the structures of colonization. So that often then when we carry out the decolonizing work in the university, it actually becomes a matter of us following the same metrics that are set up by the university to pretty much participate in the same colonial habits and logics rather than decenter those. What do you think of that?
Agreed.
As I was saying in Tāme's introduction, that the cellular structures of universities are often deeply racist, are fundamentally racist in terms of how, say, funding cycles work, how donors work, how politicians exert their influence, and often in invisible and opaque ways. So, say, for instance, in a regular setting, right, you have someone like Tāme who disrupts the colonial structures to come into the space of the university. It would be perceived or might be labeled as threatening to the structure of the university. Now, when you ask, what is threatening about Tāme speaking in the university? And it would, to answer that question, you would have to look at the cellular structure of the university and what is considered to be normative within the cellular structure of the university. And what is normative are the expectations of whiteness and white civility that keep colonialism intact and that perpetuate colonialism at the same time. So that is why an authentic decolonizing conversation would be threatening to the normative structures of a university in its everyday life. So in some ways, this is something I think of myself in terms of the work of CARE, but also in terms of the work of anti-racist interventions. That perhaps, one measure of whether you're transforming the structures or not is to look at whether you're making structures uncomfortable. That's a very good metric, because to the extent that structures are comfortable, you can be fairly certain that you're being co-opted into particular narratives of the structure where it sees that it can co-opt your voice. So the decolonized voice, of course, is welcome to the extent that it supports the multicultural narrative of the structure. But the moment it becomes threatening or the moment it becomes challenging, and those are usually the decolonizing voices of activists, the decolonizing voices that challenge the fundamental granularity of those structures, then those are silenced. And how are they silenced? They're often silenced using the norms of civility. They're often silenced by making calls to dialogue. So in my work, I've often argued that the call to dialogue itself often is colonizing. and often perpetuates racism and racist formations, because we use the appeal to dialogue or the appearance of dialogue to prevent any conversations on racism. So if you are talking about, for instance, existing racism within university structures in New Zealand, you would be considered to be uncivil, impolite, improper to the norms of the structure. So when I say that conversations and dialogue are often colonial, what I mean by that is the rules of the game are often written by the colonizer. So what it means to participate in the dialogue, how do you participate in the dialogue, who participates in the dialogue, what can you or you cannot talk about. These are all established by the colonizers. So in that sense, our ability to sit at the table, like we talk about the table as a space where we can have that conversation, right? So our ability to sit at the table is often tied to our ability to speak the language of the colonizer and to let ourselves be co-opted. So in that sense, then think about it, Steve, going back to your question, to decolonize then is to also decolonize how we talk about racism, so that racism itself doesn't become a faddish entity to engage with when it is convenient for us, but the conversation on racism is something that is grounded in the voices of colonized peoples, in the voices of migrants, in the voices of Muslims who experience racisms and bring out conversations that are inconvenient, who draw attention to the ways in which our structures work, so that we cannot get moving by saying, oh, this is not us. We are about love. But rather we begin by saying, okay, you know what, we are formed on a colonial history. What is the basis of this colonial history? Of course it is hatred. Of course it is violence. Of course it is racism. Let's have those inconvenient conversations, and most importantly, create spaces for those. What do you think of that?
Again, I agree 100%.
Yeah.